December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes forest, near the small Belgian town of Honsfeld. Snow fell lightly across the frozen ground, muffling the sound of engines as German tanks sat idle in the bitter cold. For Joachim Peiper, commander of the elite 1st SS Panzer Regiment, the situation was turning critical. His armored column, handpicked for Hitler's last great offensive in the West, had lost valuable hours, and his fuel tanks were running dangerously low. Without fuel, his mighty Tiger IIs and Panthers were nothing more than steel coffins. As Peiper studied his maps inside the cramped confines of his command vehicle, his men stumbled upon something completely unexpected: a massive American fuel depot hidden within the forest. Dozens of drums and tankers, enough to power his spearhead deep into Allied territory, stood unguarded and waiting. This moment would become one of the strangest ironies of the Ardennes campaign. Here, in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, the very thing the Germans lacked most, fuel, appeared as if fate itself had placed it before them. Yet what seemed like a miracle of war would also highlight the fatal contradictions of Hitler's plan: bold ambition colliding with the brutal realities of logistics. By late 1944, the German Reich was crumbling on all fronts. In the east, the Red Army pushed relentlessly toward Berlin. In the west, the Allies had liberated France after the D-Day landings and were steadily advancing toward the Rhine. The Luftwaffe had been bled dry, and German cities burned nightly under Allied bombers. And yet, in this desperate winter, Adolf Hitler conceived a plan that bordered on madness: a counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest designed to split the Allied armies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to the negotiating table. The plan demanded speed, secrecy, and above all, fuel. The German war machine ran on gasoline that it no longer had. By late 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had shattered much of Germany's synthetic fuel industry. Every panzer division that rolled west into Belgium did so with its tanks half-filled, gambling on seizing Allied supply depots along the way. Hitler's generals warned him repeatedly: without guaranteed fuel reserves, the offensive could collapse within days. But Hitler dismissed their concerns. In his mind, the Ardennes was a lightning strike, a swift blow that would shock the Allies into paralysis. The fuel problem, he argued, would solve itself. Once German spearheads captured Allied dumps, their tanks would roll all the way to Antwerp. To carry out this monumental gamble, Hitler turned to his most ruthless armored commander, Joachim Peiper, a man known both for his boldness and his cruelty. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was spearheading the drive of the 6th SS Panzer Army, tasked with smashing through American lines, racing across Belgium, and seizing vital river crossings before the Allies could regroup. But as the offensive began, reality quickly intruded. Snow-choked roads, stubborn American resistance, and constant traffic jams slowed Peiper's advance to a crawl. His tanks, designed for rapid breakthroughs, guzzled precious fuel while sitting motionless in columns miles long. Within just 48 hours, Peiper's spearhead faced disaster. Half his fuel was gone, and the great Ardennes gamble teetered on collapse. Then came the discovery at Honsfeld, an Allied fuel depot that seemed to appear at the very moment the panzers needed it most. On the morning of December 17th, 1944, Peiper's column rumbled into the small Belgian village of Honsfeld. The town lay just beyond the thin American defensive line, and its capture was almost incidental to the larger mission. But what Peiper's men stumbled upon there would prove critical, at least for the short term. Honsfeld housed a lightly defended American supply depot. Stacked in barns, garages, and roadside dumps were tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline, abandoned in the hasty retreat of U.S. forces. To the exhausted Germans, this was nothing short of a miracle. Peiper's troops wasted no time. They overran the American defenders in brutal close-quarters fighting, then turned their attention to the prize that mattered most: fuel. Drums and jerrycans were loaded frantically onto trucks, siphoned into panzers, and redistributed down the column. Each tank that had been running on fumes now roared back to life. For a moment, the offensive seemed reborn. With full tanks, Peiper's Kampfgruppe pressed forward with renewed energy, their armored columns cutting a swath through American positions. The captured fuel kept the spearhead alive, allowing them to push deeper into Belgian territory. But the victory at Honsfeld came with shadows. The German troops, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, also left behind a trail of destruction. Reports surfaced of prisoners being executed and civilians terrorized, acts that would later stain Peiper's name with infamy. Even as the fuel gave life to his advance, it also tied his unit more closely to the brutal reputation of the Waffen-SS. Still, in those critical hours, fuel was all that mattered. Without it, the panzers would have stalled in the forests of the Ardennes, easy prey for Allied aircraft. With it, Peiper gained just enough momentum to keep Hitler's desperate gamble alive, for the time being. But Honsfeld was only a temporary reprieve. Fuel remained the central crisis of the campaign, and as Peiper's column moved west, the question of whether they could sustain their advance loomed larger with every mile. With fresh fuel in their tanks, Peiper's column surged forward on December 17th. For the first time, the Kampfgruppe was moving with real speed, smashing through isolated American roadblocks and scattering retreating units. Civilians recalled the terrifying roar of Tiger and Panther engines echoing through the Ardennes valleys. But the same aggression that gave the Germans momentum also revealed their desperation. Every gallon mattered. Engines were shut off during halts. Tanks were kept in single file to minimize fuel consumption, and captured American vehicles were pressed into service. The hunt for fuel was relentless. By midday, Peiper's spearhead collided with retreating American artillery units and elements of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion near a crossroads outside the village of Ardennes, just south of Malmedy. After a short firefight, over 120 Americans surrendered. What happened next remains one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front. Peiper's men herded the prisoners into a field. Some accounts suggest orders were unclear. Others insist the Waffen-SS had no intention of treating prisoners humanely. Machine guns opened up. 84 Americans were murdered in cold blood. A handful escaped into the woods, later spreading word of the massacre. The killings at Malmedy sent shockwaves through Allied ranks. From that point forward, American soldiers were less inclined to surrender to Peiper's men, knowing what fate might await them. The atrocity also further darkened the reputation of the Waffen-SS and ensured Peiper himself would forever be tied to war crimes. Yet, even in the shadow of this brutality, the harsh reality of fuel hung over the operation. Each mile westward consumed irreplaceable gasoline. By the time Peiper reached the outskirts of Stavelot on December 18th, his panzers were already running low again. Ahead lay one of the largest American fuel depots in Belgium. Millions of gallons of the very lifeblood the German offensive needed. If Peiper could capture it intact, the road to the Meuse River might truly be open. If not, his advance would sputter out in the snow. The fate of the offensive now rested not on tactics or courage, but on fire and fuel. On the afternoon of December 17th, 1944, Peiper's column rumbled into the outskirts of Stavelot, a small Belgian town sitting astride the Amblève River. The town itself mattered less than what lay nearby, an enormous American fuel depot holding over 2 million gallons of gasoline. This was it, the prize, the kind of stockpile that could not only keep his panzers moving, but could, in theory, fuel the 6th SS Panzer Army's push all the way to the Meuse. To Peiper and his officers, it was a miracle waiting to be seized. But the Americans knew the stakes as well. Captain John Brewster and his combat engineers of the 291st Engineer Battalion had orders that were brutally simple: deny fuel to the enemy at any cost. As Peiper's tanks closed in, the engineers acted. They poured trails of gasoline between stacks of cans, positioned white phosphorus grenades, and prepared their detonators. At 16:30 hours, with German armor already within earshot, the order was given. The result was apocalyptic. A single explosion touched off a chain reaction that turned the depot into a raging inferno. Witnesses recalled a wall of fire leaping 100 feet into the air, with black smoke rising high enough to be seen for miles. For 3 straight days, the flames consumed the entire depot. To the Americans, it was a necessary sacrifice. To Peiper, it was devastating. He arrived too late, staring at a sea of fire, watching 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline vanish into the sky. Enough fuel to change the course of the campaign was now nothing but ash. One of Peiper's men later recalled, "The Obersturmbannführer stood silently on his turret, watching the flames. After some time, he climbed down and said quietly, 'They can afford to burn more in a day than we receive in an entire operation. What are we doing here?' The destruction at Stavelot was not an isolated event. Across the Ardennes, American engineers followed the same doctrine. At Stilmont, Spa, and Trois-Ponts, entire depots went up in flames before German forces could seize them. In just the first week of the offensive, U.S. forces deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel, more than the Germans had allocated for the entire Ardennes campaign. The message was brutally clear. Germany was fighting for every last drop, while America could casually torch oceans of gasoline to deny their use. The imbalance was not tactical, but existential. While Peiper's men watched millions of gallons burn, American logistics hummed with relentless precision. The contrast between the two sides could not have been starker. Germany, stretched thin and desperate, struggled to move limited fuel across narrow roads and forested terrain. Meanwhile, the United States had built supply chains on a scale that seemed unimaginable to the Wehrmacht. At the heart of this system was the Red Ball Express, a vast convoy network established after D-Day to transport supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. Thousands of trucks ran round the clock, covering hundreds of miles each day, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies, including food, ammunition, and fuel. Each truck, consuming only 40 gallons of fuel per day, carried enough to sustain an entire American division. By December 1944, the Red Ball Express moved massive quantities daily, making logistical bottlenecks nearly impossible. Complementing the convoy system was Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Under this daring engineering feat, pipelines ran from Britain across the English Channel to fuel depots in northern France. These pipelines delivered over 1 million gallons of gasoline per day, feeding the Allied war machine with an almost endless supply. Inland pipelines extended further, distributing hundreds of thousands of gallons daily to critical points in Belgium and France. By mid-December, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel per day, while receiving 8.2 million gallons, creating reserves even during active combat. This level of logistical abundance was inconceivable to German commanders, who often had to plan offensives assuming they might run out of fuel before reaching the first objective. Every German misstep during the Ardennes offensive could be traced back to this imbalance. Peiper's column, despite heroic effort and tactical skill, was already running on fumes. For every 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, the Americans had millions in reserve and were capable of destroying supplies faster than Germans could seize them. The lesson was brutal and unambiguous. In a modern, industrialized battlefield, victory was determined by production and logistics, not bravery or battlefield maneuvers alone. As Peiper's spearhead advanced, the full weight of Germany's fuel shortage became painfully clear. Even the capture of 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, initially seen as a miraculous windfall, could not offset the structural scarcity facing the Wehrmacht. Tiger tanks, consuming 2.5 gallons per mile, and Panthers, burning 1.5 gallons per mile, quickly drained supplies. In the unforgiving Ardennes terrain, consumption rose by 40%, further accelerating the crisis. By December 18th, Peiper's forces were already operating at a deficit. Maintenance officer Otto Dingler recorded that 67,000 gallons had been consumed since the offensive began, while captured fuel totaled only 55,000 gallons. German commanders faced an impossible choice: continue the advance and risk immobilization, or halt and concede tactical advantage. Meanwhile, Allied forces were fully aware of German shortages. Through ultra-intercepts, General Courtney Hodges issued orders to destroy any fuel that could fall into enemy hands. Americans understood the psychological and strategic impact of fuel, using it as a weapon. At Stavelot, engineers ignited over 2 million gallons, creating a firestorm visible for miles. Across the Ardennes, similar actions destroyed more than 8 million gallons in the first week alone, a sum that dwarfed the Germans' entire operational allocation. The scale of American logistics was staggering. The Red Ball Express ran continuously, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food to frontline units, while pipelines transported hundreds of thousands of gallons daily. The Germans, by contrast, had to rely on captured supplies, narrow roads, and dwindling reserves. Peiper's realization was grim. We are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we receive for this entire operation, he reportedly said. Each captured depot, once a cause for celebration, revealed itself as a small fraction of what the Americans could expend or destroy at will. The Ardennes offensive, meticulously planned by German commanders, collapsed not from enemy firepower, but from the immutable mathematics of fuel scarcity and Allied abundance. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at Lays. With only 1,000 gallons of fuel remaining, his forces could neither advance nor retreat effectively. Tanks were abandoned, immobilized not by damage, but by lack of fuel. Meanwhile, the Americans maintained a supply network capable of supporting 340,000 gallons for that day alone, a stark contrast highlighting the fundamental imbalance between the two sides. The operational reality was devastating. German soldiers fought for every liter, while Americans could destroy millions without hesitation. This disparity was not mere luck. It reflected industrial capacity, planning, and logistical superiority that had become the decisive factor in modern warfare. The fuel crisis did more than immobilize vehicles. It shattered morale and undermined confidence in Nazi propaganda. German soldiers, trained to believe in the superiority of the Wehrmacht, witnessed firsthand the overwhelming industrial power of the Americans. Even elite SS units like Peiper's could not grasp the scale of Allied logistics. Letters and diaries reveal the shock. Private Ernst Kara noted newspapers boasting new pipelines delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons per day, while German units struggled to capture a fraction of that. Soldiers saw Americans casually burn fuel, use gasoline for heating, and discard provisions, behaviors unimaginable under German wartime scarcity. Observing such abundance eroded belief in racial and operational superiority, a core tenet of Nazi ideology. German high command recognized the operational consequences but refused to adjust strategies. Hitler dismissed photographic evidence and reports as propaganda. Field Marshal Walter Model's staff recorded disbelief, noting the sheer volume of supplies captured and destroyed by the Americans. Yet, lower-ranking officers understood the implications. The war could no longer be won on German terms. The Ardennes failure exposed the fatal imbalance between planning and resources. Every German tactical maneuver depended on capturing enemy fuel, a gamble that failed repeatedly. Meanwhile, American forces leveraged redundant supply chains, pipelines, and convoys, maintaining operational flexibility while immobilizing their enemy. Soldiers internalized the reality. The Wehrmacht fought not just against weapons, but against logistics they could never match. Interrogations of captured German personnel confirmed this psychological blow. They were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of American abundance, a realization that made tactical skill irrelevant. The true backbone of Allied operations in the Ardennes was logistics on an unprecedented scale. The Red Ball Express, a fleet of thousands of trucks operating 24/7, became the lifeline of the front. By December 1944, the system delivered up to 12,500 tons of supplies daily, including critical fuel, ammunition, and rations. Each truck consumed roughly 40 gallons of fuel per day, Yet the system's throughput far outpaced any German capability, turning logistical abundance into a strategic weapon. Pipeline systems complemented this effort. Operation Pluto had already demonstrated the ability to pump millions of gallons across the English Channel. By late December 1944, pipelines feeding France and Belgium delivered over 1.4 million gallons daily, creating reserves that allowed American forces to operate without interruption. For German commanders, this was incomprehensible. Peiper's unit, stranded at Honsfeld and Stavelot, faced scarcity so severe that 50,000 captured gallons seemed miraculous. Yet in reality, it represented a fraction of what Americans could mobilize or destroy at will. Every captured depot, no matter how large, failed to materially change the operational picture, illustrating the futility of Germany's dependence on enemy supplies. Even when Germans temporarily seized fuel, American units could destroy millions more in hours, denying them any advantage. At Stavelot alone, engineers ignited over 2 million gallons of gasoline, a deliberate act that illustrated the strategic value of abundance. The Americans understood that in industrial warfare, the power to waste resources was as significant as the power to conserve them. By comparison, German logistics were rigid, fragmented, and fuel-limited. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horse-drawn transport, limited synthetic fuel, and scattered supply chains left units like Peiper's doomed before they even engaged the enemy. The contrast highlighted a fundamental truth. Industrial capacity, not battlefield valor, dictated victory in late-war Europe. The impact of fuel scarcity on German operations was immediate and catastrophic. Peiper's advance stalled repeatedly, not due to American firepower, but because his vehicles ran dry. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in combat, Panthers 1.5 gallons. In the Ardennes challenging terrain, consumption increased by roughly 40%, further accelerating the depletion. By December 18th, after covering barely 20 miles, Peiper's column had already used 40% of its allocated fuel, far short of what was required to reach the Moselle River. German commanders faced impossible decisions. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel became prizes for the Americans, while troops were forced to march on foot through freezing forests. Medical services were crippled. Ambulances, generators, and field hospitals could not operate without fuel, leading to unnecessary casualties. Soldiers witnessed firsthand the disparity in supply. Americans could burn fuel for warmth, cook rations, or destroy millions to deny it to the enemy, while German troops counted liters and ration movement. The psychological effects were profound. German soldiers, indoctrinated with notions of racial and military superiority, struggled to reconcile reality with propaganda. Captured documents, jerry cans, and destroyed depots made clear that Germany was fighting a war of scarcity against an enemy of overwhelming industrial abundance. Even elite SS units, trained for rapid mechanized operations, were helpless against the arithmetic of supply. The Ardennes offensive quickly became a race against fuel. By December 19th, Peiper's forces were critically low, tanks were abandoned, half-tracks immobilized, and the offensive momentum collapsed. American intelligence, intercepting German communications, monitored fuel shortages closely, knowing the Wehrmacht could not operate effectively without petroleum. This allowed Allied forces to anticipate movements and destroy key supply points preemptively. Every logistical advantage reinforced the lesson. In industrial warfare, the side with fuel and supplies controls the battlefield, regardless of training, experience, or courage. German officers repeatedly testified at Nuremberg that fuel scarcity dictated operational outcomes, often outweighing tactical or strategic planning. The human toll of Germany's fuel crisis in the Ardennes was staggering. Of the 5,000 men in Peiper's Kampfgruppe, only about 770 returned. Soldiers who survived the battlefield faced weeks of exhaustion, frostbite, and demoralization, knowing that their failure was not due to bravery or skill, but to an enemy who could produce and move resources on an unimaginable scale. Witnessing American abundance shattered German myths of superiority. Troops saw fuel burned casually, vehicles left running for comfort, and supply depots destroyed rather than captured, contradicting every assumption about American efficiency or resource scarcity. Private Ernst Kara later recounted finding newspapers and shipping manifests at Honsfeld, detailing fuel transported thousands of miles in weeks, a logistical feat beyond German comprehension. Morale plummeted as soldiers realized the futility of their efforts. The Ardennes offensive, once touted as a potential decisive blow, had become a demonstration of German logistical impotence. Even elite SS troops, trained to execute complex armored maneuvers, could do nothing against the simple arithmetic of fuel and supply. Psychologically, the implications were profound. German propaganda had promised superiority and inevitability of victory, but the stark contrast between scarcity and abundance undermined confidence. Field Marshal Walter Model noted the moment when reports of captured and destroyed American fuel reached him. "We are not fighting the same war." Soldiers began to grasp the scale of industrial warfare, a war in which courage alone could not overcome material advantage. The awareness of industrial superiority extended beyond the battlefield. German POWs described seeing Americans waste rations, discard fuel, and operate equipment without concern, making every German calculation feel like a fight against infinity. Letters from the front carried accounts of Americans using resources in ways the Germans considered unimaginable, reinforcing the sense that Germany's defeat was preordained once Allied production capacity fully mobilized. The Ardennes campaign made it clear that industrial capacity, not battlefield tactics, determined victory. While German soldiers were highly trained and experienced, their efforts were consistently hampered by shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. In contrast, American forces operated within a system of overwhelming logistical abundance that allowed them to sustain operations, absorb losses, and even destroy resources to deny them to the enemy. The numbers tell the story. The Germans had allocated approximately 5 million gallons of fuel for the offensive. By contrast, Americans consumed 7.5 million gallons daily, delivered 8.2 million gallons to the front, and destroyed millions more to prevent capture. The scale of American logistics made individual German actions irrelevant. Technological superiority reinforced this advantage. American refineries produced high-octane gasoline with additives that German engines could not fully utilize. Vehicles were standardized for maintenance efficiency and fuel economy. Sherman tanks used 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to 2.5 gallons for Tiger tanks. Trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon fully loaded, while German logistics relied on a mix of captured, obsolete, and domestically produced vehicles, each with different fuel and maintenance requirements, creating endless complexity. The campaign demonstrated that wars between industrial powers are ultimately fought in factories and refineries, not only on the battlefield. Peiper's capture of 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld seemed miraculous, but was negligible in the broader context of American supply. By contrast, the Americans could burn millions of gallons to deny them to the Germans, an act inconceivable to German commanders, and still continue operations without disruption. Historians and analysts later recognized the Ardennes offensive as a case study in the limits of tactical brilliance when confronted with overwhelming material superiority. Germany's failure was not due to lack of courage, training, or planning, but structural incapacity to sustain mechanized operations against an opponent whose industrial base dwarfed its own. This lesson extended beyond the Ardennes. It highlighted why the Luftwaffe collapsed, why German panzer divisions could be immobilized despite experienced crews, and why strategic outcomes were dictated by supply chains, production capacity, and resource allocation. The Germans fought with scarcity, the Allies fought with abundance, and the arithmetic of industrial warfare had already decided the outcome. By late December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had effectively exhausted Germany's last operational reserves. Peiper's men, reduced from 5,000 to fewer than 1,000 survivors, had abandoned hundreds of tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles, not from enemy fire, but from fuel scarcity. The scale of loss underscored a fundamental reality. Germany's operational capacity was entirely dependent on capturing or conserving fuel, while the Allies' vast industrial system rendered such constraints meaningless. American forces, in contrast, demonstrated the true power of industrial warfare. The Red Ball Express and pipeline systems like Operation Pluto ensured fuel, ammunition, and supplies reached the front lines faster than the Germans could capture or destroy them. For German soldiers, the experience was a psychological blow. Seeing Americans waste resources while they rationed every liter shattered the illusion of German superiority and the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht. Quantitatively, the contrast was staggering. In a single week, the Allies destroyed or consumed more fuel than Germany could allocate for the entire Ardennes offensive. Each American soldier received supplies that German units could not imagine, while every captured jerry can by Peiper's forces represented a fraction of Allied abundance. This imbalance reflected deeper strategic truths. Production, not tactics, decides war. The most skillful German maneuvers could not overcome the sheer output of American factories and refineries. Logistics define operational feasibility. Superior numbers on paper meant nothing when mechanized units were immobilized by fuel shortages. Psychological impact of abundance. Witnessing the enemy's ability to burn millions of gallons without consequence broke morale and undermined confidence in German propaganda. Industrial scale dictates strategy. Germany's attempt to launch mechanized offensives without secure, sustainable fuel sources was doomed from the start. Peiper's observations at Honsfeld and Stavelot became widely reported among German ranks, spreading awareness of the true imbalance. While Hitler and high command often refused to accept these realities, soldiers on the front lines experienced the consequences firsthand. Immobilized tanks, failed offensives, and the inability to retreat or maneuver. The lessons extended beyond 1944. The Ardennes campaign crystallized industrial warfare as a decisive factor in modern conflict. It proved that even elite, well-trained forces cannot overcome an enemy whose production and supply networks operate on a scale beyond comprehension. The collapse of German operations in the Ardennes was a predictable outcome of structural inferiority, not merely battlefield setbacks. After the war, military historians and analysts cited Peiper's experience at Honsfeld as the quintessential example of logistics overriding tactics. The abandoned Tiger tanks, still preserved in museums, stand as monuments to this truth. Every empty fuel gauge, every burned depot, every logistical map tells the story. Wars are won by those who control production, supply, and the capacity to sustain operations, not only by those who fight bravely on the front lines. The stark contrast between German and Allied resources in December 1944 revealed the futility of the Ardennes offensive. Germany's best-trained troops, advanced tanks, and tactical skill were no match for industrial supremacy. Fuel and logistics. Peiper's command: 5,000 men, 119 tanks, 70 half-tracks, 177 other vehicles. Fuel allocation: 5 million gallons. Actual captured fuel: 50,000 gallons. The remainder ran out rapidly, immobilizing his forces. The American First Army consumed 7.5 million gallons daily, receiving 8.2 million gallons without interruption. They could destroy fuel reserves exceeding Germany's entire allocation and still operate unimpeded. The Red Ball Express ran 6,000 trucks delivering 412,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Pipelines under Operation Pluto delivered over 1 million gallons daily from Britain. Fuel scarcity was a German problem. Abundance was an American advantage. Vehicle efficiency: Tiger tank, 2.5 gallons per mile. Panther, 1.5 gallons per mile. Sherman, 0.8 gallons per mile. American trucks, 8 miles per gallon. German forces operated a patchwork fleet, French, Soviet, German, with varied fuel needs and maintenance requirements, compounding logistical strain. Industrial output. 1944 production highlights. United States. 324,750 aircraft, 88,410 tanks, 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum. Germany. 119,970 aircraft, 46,857 tanks, 33 million barrels. American petroleum output alone exceeded Germany's by over 50. 1. Enabling operations, reserves, and tactical waste, like burning fuel to deny capture. Operational consequences. German forces abandoned vehicles, not from battle damage, but fuel shortages. American armies could redeploy, supply garrisons, and fly sorties without concern. Every German offensive post, 1942, faced fuel constraints, while Allied operations ran on abundance. Psychological impact. German soldiers were demoralized observing Americans destroy fuel, discard supplies, and leave engines running. Ideological assumptions of American weakness were shattered. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld illustrated that the failure in the Ardennes was structural, not tactical. Human experience. Peiper's elite troops, despite training and experience, faced war dictated by fuel and logistics. Tanks sat idle, ammunition was unusable, medical aid delayed. German letters and reports emphasized disbelief at Allied excess. Peiper later reflected, "Finding the fuel felt like victory, but seeing their reserves made clear we were already defeated." Strategic lessons. Logistics determine strategy. Supply lines and fuel dictate operational reach. Industrial capacity trumps bravery. Courage cannot overcome scarcity. Abundance provides flexibility. Allies could burn, destroy, and still operate. Psychological edge. Material superiority eroded German morale. The Honsfeld discovery exemplified the broader failure of Germany's war effort. Allied forces, operating with redundancy and surplus, maneuvered freely while Germans struggled for survival. Outcome and reflection. Of 5,000 men under Peiper, about 770 returned. Peiper survived imprisonment, but was murdered in 1976. He emphasized Allied logistics as decisive, more than firepower. The Ardennes campaign underscored a timeless principle. In industrial warfare, victory is counted in factories and barrels of fuel, not just battalions and tanks. Peiper's captured 50,000 gallons symbolized futility against oceans of Allied supply. The Tiger tank in Leglas Museum, fuel gauge empty, stands as a monument not to German courage, but to industrial arithmetic. When one side counts gallons and the other counts millions, the outcome is inevitable.